So, as I kind of talked about in my first video, my day one video, as I was leaving for this trip, the stated purpose, beyond just, seeing the country and enjoying myself in the national parks and in small towns and wherever else in the U.S., is to explore the relationship between American identity and the land. And I haven't really reflected on that a lot recently. And I think, a lot of people have asked me to kind of have you resolved what the relationship is? And no, of course, I haven't yet, and I think, I don't think I will be able to at the end of this trip, because I think this trip is more about I'm really in the data collection step, not in the conclusion drawing step. And I think there's a long process that goes to reaching that conclusion drawing. But I think at this point in the trip, it might be worth just recording some of my initial thoughts, and kind of seeing maybe how they change over the course of the rest of the trip and over the time where I have an opportunity to reflect on everything that I've seen. So I think in talking about the American relationship with the land, or the relationship between American identity and the land, I think there may be 3 threads worth identifying. And these aren't perfect categories, but I think they kind of give some insight into what the major differences are and how people conceive their relationship with the land. And so I think the first is sort of this, the Emersonian view. And I think that is one, Emersonian was one of the prominent transcendentalists. His view of the land was, kind of one of intrinsic value, and his main disciple Henry David Thoreau is kind of famous for going out for writing the book Walden, and that book was based on his time living out by himself next to Walden Pond, in the wilderness, so to speak. So yeah, this is the kind of view that values nature intrinsically, that values wilderness, that isn't interested in instrumental uses for the land, but is interested in living very closely with the land. I hope that's a good enough rough sketch. And I think there's also kind of the Jeffersonian view. Actually, the Jeffersonian view, which I think is, Jefferson was famous for kind of being, his vision for the U.S. was one of an agrarian republic, one where small communities of farmers lived very closely with the land. He really valued the farming life, and he thought that produced good Republican citizens, Republican, with a small r, not the political party. And so his vision was one of very close connection with the land, but within communities, and it was one that kind of, in contrast to the Emersonian view, it valued the land for its instrumental properties and bringing communities together, and for kind of guiding the moralities of its citizens, not for the land itself. And then finally there's kind of the cowboy view, is the best term I can come up with. And I use the term cowboy because I think this view is about individualism. It's about the cowboy of the Wild West, on his own, harnessing his cattle, his it's about the king of the open range that kind of goes it by himself. It's very much an outgrowth of the rugged individualist sort of cultural theme, cultural trope in American history. And so kind of based on my experiences so far, I think all 3 of these views are alive and well. I would say that the Emersonian view is by far the weakest. I think it mainly resides maybe in Native American communities, and few and far between in your really wild off the grid survivalists. I know there's some people like that in northern Minnesota. I'm sure they're all over, survivalist type people, but I think most people are interested in more instrumental uses for the land and are interested in the land qua land. And I think even in places where we create national parks, it's they really are very tourist centric. I think Yosemite was maybe the extreme example of this. The Yosemite Valley is just covered in lodges. There's a library in there. There's, I mean, a grocery store. Like, the land really isn't left to itself. It's not like preserved in a completely natural state. It's preserved, like, insofar as that's able to contribute to the experience of the visitors. But, like, the preserving the land in and of itself is not exactly the end as I see it. And I think that's true of, like, the Badlands too. I mean, like, the Badlands Loop Scenic Byway kind of takes you right through the park, and it's really like the land is kind of staged for tourist consumption, and it's not like preserved in a totally natural state. Anyway, I don't know if that was exactly clear, but I just don't see much of, like, that transcendentalist type relationship that lingering in the American imagination. I think as for the cowboy view, I think this is more a part of our collective consciousness than a part of our collective reality. Like, I think it's important in, like, you know, our imagination to think about, you know, the Wild West, and, like, I think the whole, like, cowboy aesthetic is, like, overemphasized. You know, like, in a place like Medora, North Dakota, it's all sort of like a reproduced cowboy town with the, you know, the high false fronts and you know, stables, and, like, the Wild West theme is kind of, like, overdone. But I don't think there's really anyone that, like, lives like that anymore. I mean, you really can't. It's not being, you know, sort of like independent isn't profitable. It's not like a good way to live. I mean, I think in the 21st century economy, interdependency dominates, you know, even dominates any profession that has to do with, you know, like, gaining a livelihood from the land. And that, of course, leaves the Jeffersonian view, which I think is by far the most dominant. It's not quite to say that, like, Jefferson's aesthetic conceptions of, like, these utopian small communities have really been borne out, because, I mean, the fact is that, like, you know, in modern agriculture, it's dominated by large corporations and not by, you know, like, your, like, a stereotypical small farmer. But that said, I think that there's still, I still think that, you know, for those who really do live on the land and make their livelihood from the land, like, there's an extreme amount of pride in land ownership, which I think comes out of that Jeffersonian view. I think maybe the best manifestation of the Jeffersonian view was in like, Minnesota, where you have these small little towns that aren't necessarily agricultural, but or, you know, like, built around mining or lumber, and, you know, they're, like, small little towns that retain that identity very much. And, like, even if those industries aren't as powerful and profitable as they once were, they retain a strong influence over, like, the culture and the identity of the people that live there. Like, you think about a town like Bemidji in Minnesota, where they have the Paul Bunyan statue, who was a mythical lumberjack with Herculean strength, and had the Baby with the Blue Ox and whatever. And yeah, they have a big statue in town. So I think that like, identity is still very important to those people, despite the fact that it might not be their main, you know, source of income, or at least not as not their only source of income anymore. I mean, I think as travel becomes easier, and, like, as the economy shifts to a more like a service-based economy, one that's not quite as dependent on the land, there is a high degree of ignorance about, like, what America even possesses. And I think even when people do take the time to, like, consider it and explore it, it often, like, it consists of, like, sort of drive-by tourism, where, like, you know, you go to a park and you stay in the lodge and you do, like, a paved hike to a particular site, or, like, you just drive to a scenic overlook and you take in the vista and then move on. Or, you know, like, you go look at, like, a particular attraction, you go to the General Sherman tree and then just leave. And it's not like you're seeing the highlights, I guess, but you're not taking the time to, like, watch the landscape change and you know, see, like, what the reality of it is. Anyway, and not to be too critical of that. Like, I think that's fine. I'm observing rather than making any kind of, like, normative comment. I think, though, maybe that the climate change crisis we're currently in, and like the broader set of environmental challenges we face have renewed or refocused some attention on the land and what exactly it means to us, and how we ought to value it. And I do think that's probably a positive thing, and I think like people are recognizing the value it can offer. Maybe the other development that has kind of pushed people to renew a focus on their relationship with the land is the kind of ability to work from anywhere and communicate from anywhere. And I think that makes many parts of the country more accessible than they were before. I'll probably point out that this whole preceding discussion was really about the American relationship with the land writ large, and not like about the relationship between American identity and the land in particular. But I do think this discussion informs the latter discussion, because if it's the case that the Jeffersonian view is the most dominant, that maybe says something that our land is representative of our work ethic, our community, our shared interest maybe. And I think if the Calvo view is more dominant, then the land is sort of part of our identity, insofar as it's where our individualism and our resourcefulness inheres. And I could go on for the others, but I think I don't know if I have a clear picture of exactly what those relationships look like, but I do think that knowing what the American relationship with the land is important for understanding how it affects or symbolizes or represents our identity. More comments before wrapping up this video that I think are a little bit more pointed and concise about the relationship between American identity and the land. And I don't know if all of them are quite as true today, but just to run through them real quick, I think one, I think the land was a symbol of freedom, because I think it used to be that when we really did have a frontier, during the period of westward expansion, you could always, if you were dissatisfied with the governments in the east, could move farther west and strike out on your own. There was always if you don't like it, leave and move further west. So there's that. I think also the land was represented opportunity, and I think fueled the narrative, or fueled the belief in the American dream, because with the land ordinance acts, it was always possible for anyone to move out west, claim a stake of land, and become a landowner. And although that wasn't, didn't turn out to be so successful, especially I think in the Dakotas and Montana and Wyoming, in semi-arid regions where it's harder to farm, the promise was still there that you could be a landowner and possess the status and the wealth that sort of symbolized for people at the time. Third, and I think this one is the most salient today, I think that the grandeur and the beauty and the immensity of the American West feeds the narrative about American exceptionalism. I think it's just true that some of the landscapes of the American West and the East are more sublime, more beautiful than what you can find elsewhere. And that's not to say they're absolutely better, but I think Glacier National Park, or the hot springs in Yosemite, or Yellowstone, or the waterfalls of Yosemite, those are really unique. And the kind of power of those landscapes is something that I don't really think exists anywhere else in the developed world quite as much. Maybe in in Iceland or somewhere like that. But, the point is that I don't know that the landscapes of the UK are quite as impressive as the landscapes of America, and I think that matters to Americans, and I think they take a lot of pride in that.